Hi everyone, my name is Courtney and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a fun little video where I'm basically going to be tier listing all the adult fantasy and sci-fi series that I have read or in the progress of reading. Over the past couple years I've been slowly transitioning from children's and YA into adult fantasy, and I've discussed my favorites before last year. I wouldn't say this is really an update or a continuation of that video, but I just wanted to kind of talk about my favorite sci-fi fantasy series and then just kind of rank the ones that I've read. And I think it's just a fun thing to do because it's just fun to rank it, but I also think it does show my personal opinions, my personal taste. I like sci-fi fantasy that is focused on characters, character-driven stories, and I love SFF that has a literary lean to it or just some type of thematic purpose to the series. And yeah, I'm very strong in my opinions and what I like and what I don't like, and so that is reflected in this tier list. It's definitely just my opinions based on my opinions. And another caveat to this video is that at some point in the future I'd like to discuss the YA and children's series I've read. There is a lot more of those books, so the video would be much longer, but I would like to do it as a joint video, YA, children's, and middle grades, so let me know if you're interested in that. Anyway, let's get into the ranking. So we're going to start on this first row, which I've organized to the series that I am in the progress of reading or I haven't finished all the books yet for. And the first one we have up is Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I've read the first two books in this series. This is the start of not just a fantasy series, but like a whole fantasy spin-off continuation story, a whole cycle of different trilogies and quartets and different books. And I honestly really like this series. I really like what Robin Hobb is doing. I like her world. I like her characters. They are frustrating at times, but I honestly could read a dissertation and listen to people talk about this series all day. I do think, for one, it's just a fascinating series and a really interesting series to read, but also I feel like it has so much to say and so much that you could dissect. But I will say, there are parts where Fitz is really annoying, and I haven't finished the series out, so I don't want to put it at A list yet, just because I haven't read the rest of the Farseer world, and I haven't even finished the series, but what I've read, I liked. So I'm gonna put it in B tier. It's very much really good, really strong, really enjoying this one, but it hasn't quite reached that A list where it's my love for the series has no bounds, or S tier where it's practically perfect. And so next we're going into the Every Heart a Doorway series by Shauna McGuire. This is a really interesting series of novellas. It is a fantasy series and it is a Portal Worlds, and it's really interesting because some of the books take place in our world and some of them take place in the Portal fantasy worlds that the children have been transported to. And this series is just really interesting. Novella series in themselves are just really uncharted ground in a lot of ways. There's only a few authors that are really going into it, especially with the sci-fi fantasy genre, and Shauna McGuire is one of those people. And so this series is just really interesting, and because it is a series of novellas, this series is definitely greater than the sum of its parts, and there's also just books that stick out to me and connect to me, and then there's books that I don't necessarily love as much. I love In an Absent Dream, Down Among the Sticks and Bones, and I really love Every Heart a Doorway and Come Tumbling Down. I really didn't like Beneath the Sugar Sky. I gave that one a 3-star. I really wasn't driving with it. And that's just kind of what happens in this series. But I would say so far, again, it is a series that I'm continuing to read. It's not complete yet. I would say it's a B tier series. It's hard because there are some of my absolute favorites on this series, and then there's ones that just don't stick the landing quite as much. But that's what's gonna happen when it is a series following different worlds, following different people. Again, they're all really interconnected, but they're following different stories, different characters. So it's not like a traditional fantasy novel where it's following just one storyline or a couple of storylines that all come together. But anyway, let's get into our next title, which is the Earthsea series by Ursula K. Le Guin. Earthsea series. That's hard to say. Le Guin was a writer of the 70s and 80s, I believe, mostly. Although she wrote all up until she passed away, I believe. But I'm really interested in Le Guin's work. I haven't read much of it. I've only read this one, and this one was just okay to me. I didn't love it. It's in that older style of fantasy novels. You're very distant from the main character, and so there's things that are interesting about it. I definitely want to read more of Le Guin's work. I want to read more of this series, and I love hearing essays and more people's thoughts and opinions. But personally, the reading experience for this one wasn't awesome for me. The world was interesting, the story was interesting, but I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to be getting out of the story. I think there's a greater theme or discussion with fantasy tropes, but I just wasn't in tune to it when I was reading it. I'll put it at C tier. It's hard to judge like a whole series just after having read one book. And it wasn't like awful. I did enjoy it, but it just wasn't quite up at the level I'd want it to be. So the next series we have is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. This is a part of the Locked Tomb series, which is a sci-fi fantasy adult series. So far all we've had is fantasy, so this is the first like sci-fi leaning, but it is fantasy. It's like in space, there's planets, there's science lab stuff, but it's definitely fantasy-y. And this series is just, it's really weird. It's hard to describe. It's hard to explain, but I love it. Every book is a little bit different, but we're mainly following Gideon and then Harrow. In the first book, Gideon is doing like one last mission for this girl who rules over her and this planet. And if she does this one last mission, she gets to like be free. And I love it. I love the writing. I love the characters. Tamsin Muir is a really interesting fantasy author, so I'm gonna put Gideon an A tier for now. So far, I've loved every book in the series. Definitely Harrow sticks out as my favorite, but since I haven't read the entire series, I don't want to put it at S tier yet. But I am definitely really looking forward to that the fourth and final book. Next series we have is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is the first book in an adult duology, and this is mostly a historical military book with like a slight tinge of fantasy. So it's really interesting in that. I personally love fantasy books that don't have fantasy, or fantasy books that don't have magic. I think it's just a really interesting concept because I feel like a lot of people sometimes like rely on the world building or like, ooh, something shiny for readers to be interested and distracted in. And so when a fantasy series doesn't really heavily rely on that, I don't know, it's just always really interesting to me. I also love like the idea of magical world with characters that can't do magic in it, or like everybody around them can do magic but they personally can't do it, or not everybody in this world can do magic and the main character is one of those people. I don't know, I just find that interesting. So this is the first book in a duology, and it's following a young person who takes their brother's place and takes on their identity so that they can take their brother's fate, who is destined to do all these great things. And I loved this first book. Personally, I don't know enough about the military stuff to know, you know, if it's actually impressive or not, but I really enjoyed the book. I enjoyed this as a first book in a duology, and I'm excited to read the next one. So again, it's the first book in a series, so I can't really put it at A or S tier yet, but I did really enjoy this first one, so I'm gonna put it at B for now. I definitely feel like it has room to move up, and again, I'm excited about the second book. I'm excited about other things that Shelley Parker Chan has to write, so it's all good. And then the next book I have is The Empress's Salt and Fortune by Nouveau, and this is again in the category of novella fantasy series. This takes place in what I believe is a fantasy world inspired by ancient China. It could be ancient China just with fantasy elements added onto it, but there is like woolly mammoths and stuff like that and talking tigers, so obviously it's like not completely our world, but I loved it. This first book was amazing and the second one was even better. I'm excited to read the third one when it comes out in paperback. It's basically a short novella series and each novel is following a different story. Our main character is a monk who is traveling around and listening to these different events and stories, and I love this framed element. I love the stories that we get. The audiobook is also really wonderfully narrated and I highly recommend the audiobook experience. I love that narrator. And again, we're 2 books in. I've given both books like 4.5 stars, so I want to put it higher in A-list. I really do. I'm gonna put it in A-list. I love it that much. I enjoyed it that much. It was my favorite book of the year for this past year, so I think I'm gonna have to put it in A-list, even though it's not anywhere near complete and we've only gotten like the first 2 books. So the next book is another first book in a series, which I started last year, and this is The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. This was like all vibes, no thoughts, head empty kind of vibe. Not really, like it's like a dark academia fantasy series, but it's really interesting because it's like the characters are already proficient in magic and they're already proficient in their studies and stuff, so like we only get like a glimpse into how the magic works. Mostly it's just like watching these characters watch each other and slowly trying to piece together who they are and like their backgrounds. I really enjoyed it, but again, this is the first book in a series and I definitely feel like this series has room to be like overblown or overdone or just too long. I want to put it in between B and C. Like I'll put it in B for now. I really enjoyed that first book. It was a fun time. It was like a 3.75 read, and it was just dumb and enjoyable. And I shouldn't say dumb. It's a really interesting book, and I really like how the story is told through these characters watching each other and just like them being super pretentious. I don't know. It worked for me. The next book I have is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. There are 2 books in this trilogy out already, and I love this series. It's really interesting. It's not like my all-time favorite series, but it's like very solid, very good, has all the elements that I like. We're following a couple different characters. One is a sun priestess, one is a like traveling mercenary captain of a ship, and another one is a boy who has been raised to be like this evil, all-powerful force and to take revenge for other people. It's a really interesting pre-colonial inspired indigenous setting. I didn't quite love the second book as much as the first one, but I still really enjoy this series. I love just the world and again the characters. I feel like I'm one of the only people that really loves the Sun Priest character. But yeah, I'm waiting for the series to be finished out to give my full opinions, but so far I really love this series. I feel like it's definitely slept on a little bit and people don't love it as much as they should. To me, it does everything right. It has a good plot, good characters, good emotional stakes. Like, it's doing everything right. And again, Rebecca Roanhorse is an author I want to read like basically everything that they've come out with. The next series we have is Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. I have read the first 4 books in the series and I want to read the 5th one, I guess. I don't know. I'm not super interested in this series, to be honest. Like, I don't really care that much. Like, I'm not saying it's not good, because it is, and like I would read essays discussing Game of Thrones and like how Martin uses history and medieval spaces. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about the Game of Thrones series. Actually reading it is not that enjoyable. I did like the 3rd book. I thought that was a really intense 3rd wonderful book. Those like little scenes that we were building up to throughout the first 2 books, like yes, that build up was great. Those moments, those battles, those weddings were perfect. Like, they were great, but like it does not make up, I don't think, for the entirety of the series, because in a lot of respects this series is really difficult to slog through. And while I understand why George R.R. Martin has like rape and incest and like deep misogyny for his characters, like, you know, it makes sense for the world he's building, it doesn't mean that it's enjoyable to read. So like, this series is good in hindsight, but I wouldn't say it's the best reading experience. Honestly, these kind of like grimdark series, it's also just really frustrating to read because you keep seeing characters make the wrong mistakes. Do you even want them to make the right choices? Because like, they're not good people, so it's a dilemma. You know, I would read essays on this. I would love to discuss it and just like no academic opinion, but it's like a series I don't really want to finish, and who knows if it'll ever be finished. And yeah, it's not my favorite read. And then the final book in the series that I have not finished, we have Axiom's End by Lindsay Ellis. This is a fantasy series, alien first encounter story. The first book is like very much a fun romp, feels like a alien sci-fi movie, but still has enough emotional depth to it that it to me wasn't boring. I personally am just coming into alien stories. I didn't super love them to begin with. You know, I just find that first encounter alien invasion kind of story to be very stressful and not a fun reading experience way. But this kind of changed my mind. I just like what Lindsay is doing with this series. So this first book, it's like a 3.75 stars. It's like a fun, feels like a sci-fi movie romp. But the second book was emotionally intense and just a very like intimate story of just one young woman, and it was insane. Like, I'm definitely waiting for the rest of the series. I want to see where this goes. It's definitely like a watching the main character crash and burn kind of a series, but it honestly is, that second book was really amazing. I think B. It's like really solid, really good. Definitely has room to move up, but yeah, I highly recommend that series. It's a really good alien story. So getting into series I've completed, the first one we have on here is Bonds of Brass by Emily Skrensky. This first book, loved it, was so excited. It promised itself to be a fun sci-fi romp with a lot of romance, and the second and third book were bad. They were really bad. Look, there's another tier list just for this one. Wow, look at that. Something has opened up for you. Ugh, God, I wanted to love this series so much, and I think that's what hurts me the most, is that I wanted to love this series. I loved the first book. It had so much promise, so much potential, and so for it to crash and burn and just be so mediocre and just not good, It was really disappointing. So yeah, it's like one of the series that really not great. So yeah, it can go down there. But what is great is Octavia Butler, let me tell you. Octavia Butler is a fantasy sci-fi dystopian author. This one is a sci-fi dystopian story, and it is a duology, and it's following a young girl who lives in this community basically at the edge of the apocalypse, and it's kind of her growing up into adulthood, leaving her community for the first time. It happens in a very close future, and so many things that Octavia Butler predicted are insane. This is told through journal entries, so it's really interesting in that aspect. There are some aspects that are really difficult to read for this series, but it is a really excellent series. We're gonna move this here, and then we're gonna move this into B tier, and then we're going to put the Atlas 6 down in C tier. It's good, but it doesn't need to be up there with Octavia Butler, let's be real. That looks better. And then the next series we have on here is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green, or the Carl's duology. This was good. It is another like first encounter alien story, but it is very hopeful. The aliens are very neutral-ish, and it's mostly a story about humans and human connection and human interaction, and a little bit about watching a disaster girl like crash and burn. I loved it. I really like this series. It's definitely ended up on favorites of the year, so I feel like it should be an A tier. And then the next series we have on here is Foundry Side by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is a fantasy story set in a Verona, Florence, Italy, medieval Italy inspired setting. So basically there are like merchant houses, but instead of like inventing art and different machines and stuff, they're inventing like science-y magical tech. This series is really solid. I loved the first one. The second one wasn't quite my favorite, but it has great characters, great plot. It's not quite as intimate as I would like at times. I feel like the series was definitely so focused in, especially the first and second book, so focused in on the plot and like murder mystery kind of aspect and heisty kind of aspect that it didn't quite get into the characters as much as I would have liked. But overall, it's really solid, really well balanced between all the different aspects from world, character, plot. And if someone told me this was their favorite series, I would believe them. I would understand. The third and final book, that was where the magic was for me. I thought that was an excellent ending to a series, just an excellent finale, what the world evolved into through those first two books into the third book was absolutely exceptional. It's not quite my favorite thing of all time, but it is really, really good, really solid. I definitely recommend it. Definitely think more people should read it, and I'm gonna put it there. The next series we have is The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, and this is a fantasy series with a Russian-inspired setting. It might actually be historical Russia with magic involved, but it's definitely like, it's historical inspired, but definitely magical. And I read this series pretty much back to back to back. I was completely engrossed. It is slow, it is character focused, it is character driven, but just so addictive and excellent to read. I love the writing, I love the characters. This series is also just really intense, but it's really good. It was an excellent series. And that third and final book, again, was phenomenal. So I think I'm gonna put it in A tier. It has rereadability, it was really good, and it does everything that I like with like young woman growing into her own power kind of story and fantasy. The next series we have on here is Dawn by Octavia Butler, and this is another first encounter alien story, but in this novel, the main character wakes up and discovers that she's on an alien spaceship. It is like years in the future, humanity has been destroyed, the aliens have like saved some of them and are trying to acclimate them so that they can go back on Earth. This first book, Dawn, was exceptional. I was on the edge of my seat. It talked about so many different things and used that sci-fi setting to talk about so many things in such a excellent, nuanced way. And that first book, it was like disturbingly good. It was disturbing, but it was also really good. The second and the third book were not quite, I don't want to say enjoyable because like the first book again was disturbing, but like the second and third book I don't think quite expanded the way I was hoping to. It follows different characters, but I felt like Octavia Butler was kind of just going on the same points. I wanted her to really expand into different things, but there's so much that could be discussed about this series. There is so much room for interpretation. Her work is excellent. The next series we have on here is A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, or the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers. This is a sci-fi story companion series, each following its own story, its own world, but set in like the same system and has reoccurring characters. And I love this. This is going to be our first S tier. So many of the books were 5 stars. It has one of my favorite books of all time, which is the second book, A Closed and Common Orbit. I loved all the books in this series. I love just how slice of life it is while also having great characters and great plot. Some people might say it's too soft, but it is perfectly soft for me. And getting into Becky Chambers' second series, A Psalm for the Wild Built. This is like another slice of life sci-fi story. This one's set on a distant Earth. Becky Chambers writes hope punk. She writes beautiful stories, and I love A Psalm for the Wild Built as well. I don't quite want to put it in S tier. Again, it's a newer series for me, so it's like still something that I'm cherishing, but I think on reread it could definitely end up in S tier. The next series we have on here is The Final Empire, which is by Brandon Sanderson. What is this series called again? Oh, this is called the Mistborn series. This was like my first series by Brandon Sanderson, and honestly, as good as an author he is, as I understand like why people like him, but I honestly don't have any interest in reading his other stuff. There's just other authors that I've liked their work more and want to get more into, and there's other authors that I still want to discover. Whereas like with Brandon Sanderson, I was like, yep, I read it, this was great, but I don't want to read anymore. And I think a lot of people will find that surprising, but that's just kind of how I feel. I personally love the world he built. I love the magic he built. I like the characters. I like the plot. And this first book in the Mistborn world was exceptional. I was on a train in England reading this book and I was poring over it. I was so engrossed by this first book. The plot twists, the turns. It's really a heist novel, but just the way that the bigger story opens up and the bigger problem opens up and how the world is expanded was really great. The first book has remained my favorite. I thought the second book wasn't quite as strong, and to be honest, did not like the ending of the series. I feel like that's controversial. I feel like most people really like the ending. I thought it just got a little too religious-y for me. You know, like some of it is Brandon Sanderson like setting up the religion for this world and like what is going to come in the rest of the series, but I felt like in general it got a little too religiously preachy in the I'm a Christian man writing a fantasy series kind of way, and not in a I'm making a fantasy religion. So like the first book is like an A. Here, maybe here, I don't know. It's hard because I really do like this series and I really do like that first book. It is a series I would recommend. But again, I am not really super interested in reading anything else that Brandon Sanderson has written. Like, I got a taste, I understood, but there's other authors that are doing stuff that I want to read more. But okay, I'll put it here just because I do like this series. The next book we have is going to be A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. And I don't like this series. I haven't read all of V.E. Schwab's work, so I can't really say, but I don't love everything they write, as this series is testament to, and I don't really have interest in reading anything else by them at this point. I read Vicious and I like Vicious, and honestly, that is good for me. I'm good with that story, and I don't really need to read any of their other works. Especially when it comes to this one. I am intrigued by the world, but I didn't really like how it was utilized in the story, and I absolutely despised the main character, Delilah Bard, and Kel was just kind of meh. And that third and final book was great, but like, one book can't make up for the pain that I went through for the first series. The first book was a 3 stars. It was very mid, and that second book was awful. I think I gave it a 1 or a 2 star. Like, I really, really despised it. And so even though the third book was like a 3.75 or a 4 star, it just can't make up for the rest of the series. So yeah, you can go down here with Bonds of Brass. That's how much I don't like it. And then the next series we have on here is the infamous Lord of the Rings. I've actually read this series twice. Once for class, so like once was not of my own volition, but yes, I've read this series twice and I like it. I like the Lord of the Rings. The movies might be better just because they are a little bit more enjoyable and a little more concentrated, but I like the Lord of the Rings. It's not my favorite. I don't think about it often like some people do, but it's good. Like, you know, it's a classic. It is doing the thing. So I feel like it should go right there in the middle. I feel like that's a good spot for it. Please don't hate me. Like, there is so much I could say about Lord of the Rings. I've written a research paper on it. I would gladly read other people's research papers on it, but like, I think I would rather watch the movies than read the Lord of the Rings series for a third time. And so for our final book in the series, if I haven't forgotten anything that unless I forgot something. But the last book in this adult sci-fi fantasy series is the 5th season by M.K. Jemisin, and this is my favorite series. I saved it for last. It is my favorite series. What it does with the characters, the world, like this series is as close to perfect as it could possibly get. The perspective, the character work, the world, how the story expands and grows as the series continues. The use of perspective again is on par with any literary author. It is very literary, very thematic, but also again has enough of the fantasy and like just good story along with the storytelling and the craft. It is chef's kiss perfect. And it has to go on S tier because, again, it is my favorite fantasy series, not just like fantasy series adult, pretty much favorite fantasy series. And I would love to read it again as like a first timer, but I would also love to read it again knowing everything that I know now what happens in the series. But yes, that's going to do it for this tier ranking video. Again, this is just the adult SFF, and this is the SFF series. So I love a good standalone, and I definitely will have to do a video talking about my favorite standalone fantasy novels at some point. But again, I also have a children's and adult series that I've read pretty extensively, at least what was popular when I was growing up. I feel like I've really read the backlist for like 90s and 2000s kids, so maybe someday we will do that tier ranking as well. But I have a lot of fantasy and sci-fi series that I want to read, a lot of other stuff out there, so this is only the beginning for me and my sci-fi fantasy journey as an adult. So I will take you along hopefully as I read more series. But thank you so much for watching. I hope this was fun for you guys as well. Let me know some of your tier listings, what you would consider the best of the best or the worst of the worst. But thank you so much for watching and happy reading.